Here's the uncomfortable truth that most CROs don't want to hear. Your ICP is just too broad. And what's that doing? It's costing you everything. You're chasing every deal, saying yes to every industry, every company size, and every user case. And while it feels like momentum, what you're actually doing is burning cash and confusing your team. Welcome back to Rev-n-u Unplugged. A quick favour before we get started. If you're getting real value from these shows, please hit subscribe and drop us a like. As I said before, it genuinely makes a difference. My guest today is Bob Moore. He has spent over 30 years in enterprise sales. He's seen what happens when companies go too wide, too fast, and he's got the battle scars to prove it. He is the CRO at Kinetic-Q, and today he's going to tell you exactly why staying narrow wins every single time. Rev-n-u Unplugged is brought to you by Indigo, the boutique recruitment consultancy placing elite sales talent for high growth technology companies. Okay, sit back, grab a brew, and let's get to it. This is Rev-n-u Unplugged. Bob, welcome to Rev-n-u Unplugged. It's a pleasure and a joy to have you on the show. We've got three really interesting topics that we're going to be discussing. Getting uncomfortable with narrow ICP, working with military veterans and D1 athletes and transforming them into enterprise salespeople, which I'm super interested in. And then also serving enterprise sales in a world that prefers the PLG and transactional. So before we dive into the detail of those, Bob, it'd be great if you could just give our audience a little idea of who you are and what you get up to.
Yeah, thanks, James. Appreciate you inviting me to be on. My name's Bob Moore, and currently the Chief Revenue Officer at a company called Kinetic-Q. I like to say I've got kind of a boring, consistent career, and that all I've ever done was tech sales and tech sales leadership for upwards of about 30 years now. I've done it at the enterprise level with household names like IBM, SAP, Informatica, and then a whole host of different startups. So kind of seen the movie at different levels, different angles, and all of that, and I've enjoyed it and like doing it and foresee myself doing it for a bit more.
Amazing. I would like to start with narrow ICP and getting uncomfortable. So I think it's really important. Many sales leaders that I talk to on this podcast and in general talk about ICP and getting ICP right. One bit that I want to say to you first is most CROs want to chase every deal, or they kind of get pushed towards that. How do you build the discipline to stay narrow on ICP, particularly when the board's kind of breathing down your neck saying you need numbers, need volumes, need pipeline full?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is don't confuse the pitch deck to the investors with the go-to-market deck, because everybody wants to talk about TAM, and a big TAM is better. I guess that's right for the investor slides, but it's kind of a death knell if you try to go too broad too quick. And of course, everybody does want to try to do that. I think you said in the beginning there that most CROs get ICP right. I would say they probably don't, to be honest with you. It's a very broad definition of what they're going after. A lot of times it's just more of a demographic. Oh, we're going to go after manufacturers, $1 billion to $5 billion or $1 billion to $10 billion, in North America. But it doesn't really address what makes one company ideal over another. What's the difference between, one $1 billion manufacturer of widgets and another one? One might be a great prospect for us. The other one would be a horrible prospect for us. So I think you got to really get down, a couple levels further into, what actually makes a customer, ideal. So I think that's the big piece that I think a lot of companies just try to be too broad. And to do anything, it's really around focus and discipline. If you're going to go out and run a marathon, the first thing you're not going to do is go out and try to run, 26 miles on a weekend. You might start with 2 miles, and you're going to do this over, a long period of time to get to the point where, you can do the 26. So it's really like just any kind of mastery. The more, in my opinion, the more narrow you can make it, the easier it becomes, the better you can get at things. So I think that's the big piece. Obviously, the investors and, people want to see a larger outcome, going after a larger TAM, all that kind of stuff. But in order to get that repeatability, that's so critical in the early stages, I just think the more narrow you can go, the better. And it doesn't necessarily mean narrow. It can be narrow in different sense. It could be we're just going to focus on this particular market. It could be a particular feature set within the product. One of the things I mention this a lot, is that back in 1999, I actually worked for a company called Blue Martini Software, which was famous for a couple reasons. One, it was one of the prolific .com, rise and bust stories in the .com, bubble burst. So that was a painful lesson to learn. But the other thing that was notable about it is we were the first beta customer for Salesforce. And I was the first salesperson hired at Blue Martini. So I like to tell people, James, you have the distinction of talking to the first sales rep on the planet Earth ever to get yelled at for not updating Salesforce. But the reason I bring it up is even back then in 1999, Salesforce was incredibly narrow. They were Salesforce automation. It was a cute way to put some contacts up, in a browser and manage a Rolodex, more or less. Of course, there was more to it, but it was basically tracking opportunities and contacts, and that's it. And it was only that for several years, a decade, before it really started getting, wider. So for me, I think just being really concrete and addressing, a specific set of problems, in a market is a, more efficient way to go.
Love that. So let's really understand that. For any sales leaders who are listening, how does Bob work out his ICP? What are the leading indicators that you're looking for that helps you understand if someone should be an ICP or just a nice name?
Yeah. Well, I think I have the benefit, in some of the places that I've been at, I've had the benefit of they already have some customers. I'm coming in maybe at, let's say, 5 million ARR mark. So they have some early customers. And of course, if you've built a $5 million company, you've built something special. Most companies don't ever get past $1 million. So to get to 5, there's something to be said for that. But a lot of times it's, well, if we're at 5 million in ARR, surely we've got product market fit. And, I've gotten into those situations before where, yes, you might have 30 customers, doing 28 different use cases across 8 different industries. And really what you have is a bunch of companies that are paying you for, some kind of a custom solution. I think in that world, you can confuse product market fit with, some paying customers. And then eventually, if that doesn't get rectified, they start to churn, over time. But, in other situations I've joined where they have, a handful of customers that are successful, they're renewing, they're expanding. So something is right there. So I think it's really understanding, what makes those customers special and what are, the consistent attributes across the use cases or the industry or the geography, or the archetype of the company, because you've got your different, early adopters versus laggards and whatnot. So I think it's really trying to see what, learning from, the companies that you've had some success with, and then trying to find, the easiest thing to do from there is really try to find some lookalikes for, those markets, use cases, and then kind of grow it from.
So I think it's really important what you say there is, particularly when you're talking about the leading indicators, they are all to do with sales that have been done and customers that you've had, not looking at leads and opportunities and people that have an interest in your product. Just for the founders at early stage who might be listening to this, who think ICP is all the people that are interested in your product, why is it dangerous that you look at ICP on that side of the fence and not on the side of the fence that you mentioned there of customer usage and renewal, which I think is critical?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the easiest thing to do in a startup is burn cash. That's pretty simple. Everybody figures that one out and they get pretty darn good at it as well. So, but a lot of that is really, I feel like the broader you are until you've kind of dialed it in, you really don't want to be pouring good money after bad or putting fuel on the fire. Most companies, I think, make the mistake that they're ready to scale. And if you look at, I'm probably following Mark Roberge, which I'm completely intimidated by, but
yeah.
Which I've read, which is really good because, I've been following his blogs for years and he's kind of put it into, a $17 Amazon book that is quite enjoyable. In there, it's really around, it talks a lot about companies trying to scale before they've actually gone through and earned the right to get to product market fit and then eventually go to market fit. So I think, that's the big piece. And I think the beauty of going narrow is you can always go wider later. It's a lot easier to, widen the lens. It's a lot harder if you start out, wide and then try to narrow it down because you've probably burned through a lot of your capital, before to really kind of execute a proper, call it a pivot or adjustment, course correction, whatever you want. But I think it's just, you've got to find repeatability, especially, an early stage company that is eventually, wants to get out of the founder-led sales motion and hire their first, reps to try to figure out, how do we repeatably find leads? How do we move them through the cycle? How do we sell them, close them, onboard them, expand them, get them to adopt what they've bought and get them to expand and renew. So it's, from my perspective, if you try to go too wide, you start taking on, if you're going after too, again, depends if you have a horizontal solution, a data product, or an application. But for example, if you're building in our world, for example, a supply chain solution, if we try to go after too many different industries, we're going to have to start to build features and functions that cater to, maybe the aerospace and defense versus pharmaceutical versus medical device versus consumer products. All of that takes time and money and dilutes all of our efforts. So it's really important, I think, to stay on task.
Makes a lot of sense. How often are you reviewing your ICP, and do you remove an ICP that once was good and isn't right anymore? And how do you, once you've done that, how do you get the message right to your sales guys that that's no longer an ICP, but they just want to chase the sales? So probably the first bit is that how often are you reviewing, and when do you realize that something that was right isn't right anymore?
Yeah, it depends on a lot of different factors. But again, I think the key is you have to be open, because in the early stages, you're still in a learning process. You think you may have gotten the ICP right, and then you kind of go after it and you realize, well, maybe not for whatever reason. So you need to be able to learn from that and then adjust accordingly. So I think you're always looking at it, but you also have to have some patience too, because everybody wants the sales to come quicker. Especially most of my career has been selling to the enterprise. So, complex sales and take a long time, all those kinds of things, high stakes, high time, all that kind of stuff. So, there's a level of patience that's required. If you're selling something that's a little bit more transactional, say a 30-day type of a sales cycle, and you're doing large volume, that's a lot of data points to learn from quickly. It's quite a bit harder, at the enterprise level. I've been in situations where, we've focused on, we went with an industry focus first, focused on pharmaceutical, a set of 3 or 4 use cases that we knew we could solve, and got traction there, kind of at the mid-market. And then, we're able to grow that into the larger, the top 10 global pharmas as well. And then how do we expand from there? In that situation, we looked at it from what's an adjacent space, and we were selling a data management platform at the time, and a lot of it was dealing with third-party data sets in the medical industry. So this would be like prescriber data, healthcare organization data, basically doctors, healthcare providers, they would call them. So we looked at, other use cases in other industries outside of pharma manufacturing that would leverage the same data sets. So it's the same product, it's managing roughly the same data, but you're pointing it at a very different use case. And we were able to take that to healthcare providers that were dealing with a lot of the same data. So that kind of opened the healthcare provider space. And at least in the US, if you look at that, those are basically insurance companies. So then the jump from healthcare payer, insurance to property and casualty, specialty insurance, was not a big jump. So it's just, again, and every time we did that, we grew our ICP. We also grew our ICP, from a geographic perspective. A lot of these companies were global companies that started in the US, but they brought us to the UK quickly. They brought us to Europe quickly to expand into their organizations. And then obviously we started going after those markets as well. So now your ICP broadens from an industry, geo perspective, as well as revenue size perspective.
Perfect. Well, look, I really appreciate it.
And I think the other thing is just, you mentioned on the sales reps, a lot of it is the training and enablement in the direction. I mean, at the end of the day, like if you don't point your reps in the right direction and give them the proper enablement and training they need to go after that and be effective, they're just going to do, they're going to do what they want to do. And, now you're starting to get into sales-led selling, which is really kind of a dangerous place to be, which I've been before. Probably been guilty of it myself.
I really appreciate your insight on that. I think ICPs, it's a really critical point. I think it's something that won't go away. We're going to move on to enterprise sales versus PLG, which is a really interesting topic. It's not one that's been brought up before. Before we go into the questions I have there, what made you want to talk about enterprise versus PLG? What's been on your mind about that?
I actually forgot that it was on my mind and on my list, so I wasn't even thinking about it. I thought we were going to cover a different topic, but that's okay. I think PLG, it still obviously applies. It was very, very hot, years ago. I think that's kind of what everybody talked about. PLG is going to put the enterprise sale out of business. And that was really where a lot of the investment was going. And, even myself, we had those pressures internally ourselves, like how do we make our product, easier to sell? And do we go towards, a freemium model or trial, whatever. So, and again, a lot of that was coming down from the investors. Like, we love they love the enterprise deals when they come in the middle of a board meeting when you get a DocuSign for a couple $1 million deal. But, the following board meeting, when one of those slips to the next quarter, they don't like them too much. And it's like, why don't you have, a lot of smaller deals that we can grow? So there's always a natural inclination to drive to that. And but I think the thing that I learned, again, just trying to take an enterprise product and make it PLG, you can wish it all you want, but it really doesn't happen. And I guess the lesson I learned is it's not really a sales motion at all. It's really a full company motion. I mean, it really has to start with the product, or it starts with the problems you're trying to solve. What problem you're trying to solve in the market, and have you built a product, that can solve it, and is it something that can be implemented quickly? When we talk about implementations and weeks, not months, in the PLG world, it's hours, not days, and maybe minutes, not hours. And that's a very different product, right? Like the typical enterprise product. Even, I've been in situations where I've gone to my CEO and said, hey, we want to give this thing away or sell it for rather than $500,000 a year, let's sell it for $5,000 a year. Great. We can do a credit card swipe and we can sell it. But the minute you come in and tell them it's an 18-month implementation and you're going to drop, $2.5 million with a large SI just to get it up and going, that model just falls apart. And so not every product is really designed to that. So what I learned around PLG is it's very much a whole company motion, starting with the product all the way through marketing into sales, which is the natural kind of go-to-market continuation. As salespeople, we like to think that sales is the center of the universe, like everything starts and ends with sales. It really isn't. It's really the tail of the dog, if you will. It's really starting with those problems, the products, and then the marketing, and then sales is really taking the hill. So again, that's kind of what I learned. But that said, there are a lot of things within PLG that make sense. If you look at the PLG playbook, can you take some pages out of that? Absolutely. I mean, certainly, being able to track usage and adoption with data, that's super important. That's kind of right out of the PLG playbooks. And a lot of the enterprise solutions in the early days really couldn't do that. But if you could, it would give you, a strategic, heads up on expansion and retention, renewal, all those types of things. So I think it's things like that, making it easier to implement. Anytime we can reduce the time to value, that's a good thing. Maybe we don't get to hours or days, but if we can get to weeks, not months, that's a good positive thing. But I think, it's settled down a lot. I remember, when I was talking to companies, either advising or even interviewing, I was kind of like, hey, like this, there's no place in the world for an enterprise, guy like me anymore because everything's PLG and all that. And it really wasn't the case. I think a lot of that kind of settled down. I think what a lot of companies ended up with was a lot of companies with free product, not paying them. And how do you then take that to the enterprise and drive adoption and drive value at the enterprise level is a very different, it's a different animal.
Yeah, so I'd like to dive into that, particularly churn. Churn is high. Is churn high now because of PLG? It's never been easier to switch off technology, and where there's almost no human element involved, is that given a reason as to why so many companies are seeing churn?
I don't know. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? If it's, if the investment is, too small, it's kind of a rounding error. Like it's easy to, a lot of times it's just easy to turn that off, right? Because they're probably not getting a lot of value out of it anyways, if it's a low dollar spend item. So those are easy to turn off. The problem is, when you keep doing it over and over and over again, it starts to add up and it really impacts the churn. On the other side of the coin, a much larger spend item, yeah, that's an easy target. Why are we spending this much money on this particular solution? It's also harder to just kind of pull out and unplug, and the switching costs could, be, prohibitive at that point as well. So it's kind of, like I said, it's a double-edged sword of, kind of where you're at. To me, it's really just, it's value, right? If you can't justify the value that you're delivering to the customer, no one's going to pay for something they're not getting value out of it. So, and I think that's what I think a lot of companies are seeing, especially as the technology changes at the pace it's changing. And Obviously, there's new AI tools, and I've been in a situation where we had a very specific secret sauce to the market, and companies, were buying our software. They're paying us a lot of money for it, and then literally, with basically ChatGPT coming out and the advent of generative, AI, basically commoditized, I wouldn't say everything, but it commoditized a large portion of what we were doing, where companies could do 80% of what we were doing, with their own tools and people. And so why spend for, a large enterprise software products? That kind of dilutes the market, presents new options that are more cost effective, easier to implement, those types of things. So I think it's a combination of that. But again, if you're providing a solution that's delivering value, then it's just going to be a lot harder to.
And if there's a company starting over now or building now who was a true enterprise business, do they start with PLG, or do you build enterprise and then build a PLG motion afterwards, in your experience and your advice?
Yeah, the one last thing I was just going to say on some of the churn we've seen as of late, a lot of it, I think the ones that are most vulnerable are the user-based, seat-based licenses, because a lot of, it's just the world's changing, right? Companies are adopting AI to do more with less employees means less users, those types of things. So I think we're seeing a lot of that as of late. So we've got to kind of address that user-based model going forward. So I think your question was, do companies start with PLG and move to the enterprise, or do they start with the enterprise and move to PLG? Is that what you're asking?
Particularly if they are a genuine enterprise, not a mid-market commercial transactional business, but they're a genuine enterprise. Do you start PLG from the get-go now, or do you build enterprise and then work backwards to a PLG motion?
Well, I'm biased, and I've never done the PLG up, so I only know from the enterprise down, and never even got fully to the PLG. That actually worked, right? We gave away a lot of free software, but that wasn't PLG. That was just giving away free software. So biased. I mean, I think companies have done it both ways, obviously. From my perspective, I think it's easier. Maybe you're not selling to the largest companies on the planet, the enterprise, but you're selling to, more sizable organizations. I think it's easier to go down market than it is to go up market. But I think somewhere starting in the middle, again, it's really not so much where you start from company size, it's really the product that you have, like what type of product do you have? Are you addressing a user productivity problem, or are you addressing a large, financial problem, or a manufacturing problem, insurance problem for the organization? So I don't think there's a right, or a wrong way. I think if you look, I think there's a blend of the two. I mean, if you're going to build an enterprise product, and you want to sell to consumer products goods companies, you probably don't start with Procter & Gamble and Unilever, though, probably several have. It's probably easier to go more in the mid-market to, hopefully get some faster sales, get more of the learning process, get that feedback, and then kind of hone the solution, and then, eventually move to the larger companies.
Do you think that the consumer has driven this continued growth in PLG because they basically just want to try something for nothing and see if it works? And is that damaging what the enterprise true value is and the journey that they're going on, because they're having to work towards how consumers might be buying now?
Well, I think it's, I don't know. I think it's your experience, on this at your kid's soccer game on the weekend is very different than when you show up in the office on Monday morning and you log on to a, God forbid, not a green screen, but, maybe something a little bit nicer than that. But so it's kind of like, why can't I have that same experience at the office as well? So I think that and again, people adopt the consumer apps a lot faster and quicker than their enterprise apps. So I think the consumers are actually driving the vendors to make their product more usable, easier to adopt, easier to install, those types of things. So I think that's a good thing. Makes the product, it ultimately makes the product more valuable and stickier. So I think it's a positive piece. Yeah, there's probably some of that. It just makes sense, right? That's how they want to buy. I think, I'm just trying to remember the second part of your question there.
I mean, that pretty much answers the main play of it. When do you, if you're in that mid-market moving through to the enterprise, when do you think, are there any leading indicators that you could see that you're ready to do a PLG motion, or is it something that you've got to be building towards all the time because you know it's something that you've got to add?
Yeah, like I said, I don't have a success to point to where we've done it. Like I said, we've kind of said, hey, like we need to, we need a higher velocity sales model. So I've got an idea. Let's go after smaller companies. Let's reduce the price point of the product, and let's see if we can increase the velocity. I don't know how many companies I've been at where new leadership has come in and said, this is what we're going to do, and it's like it's the last guy wanted to do, and I wanted to do the same thing 5 years ago, but it's just it's hard to do. You're going to end up just giving away a lot of free software. First off, you've got an engineer, you pretty much have to create a different product, perhaps for that market. Now you're in a situation where you have your enterprise product, and your mid-market or your SMB product, and you're probably not big enough to support, 2 complete product development teams and everything that's associated with that. So you're just gonna, kind of burn a lot of time, and money. So yes, I think it's a hard move. But I would think as the product gets easier to develop and build, and as you start to see demand at that level of the market, those could be signals to start to consider it.
Makes sense. Going to move on to the final topic, which is super interesting, about hiring athletes and military veterans. Not just these guys, but the success you've had and what's in it. Let's look at the athletes first. D1 athletes. For those of you who are like me, what's a D1 athlete? Have I made that up when you said D?
No, it's pretty good for a Brit. It's Division One. It's the highest level of collegiate sports. So it's pretty much become professional at this level, given that they're now being paid and all of that. So I don't think so. That's kind of the highest level there, the highest rigor, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily D1. I mean, I think it's more the athletic or the athlete's mindset, whether it's D1, D2, D3, or D nothing. I think it's having those kind of DNA level attributes that a lot of athletes have. I think bodes well for enterprise sales.
Talk to me about that DNA then that they have. What do they have particularly that you've seen that puts them as potentially good at selling enterprise software?
Yeah, I think when you're in the enterprise world, and I kind of define enterprise not so much by size of company or size of deal, though those are certainly factors. It really comes down to complexity. I think anytime you get in a situation where you've got multiple stakeholders who all are going to have an influence and a say in that decision, and those could be, upwards 8, 10, 12, maybe even more. Now you're dealing with, and you got to win all their votes, and each one of them has a different agenda, different set of needs, different, desires, all that kind of stuff. It's complex. That takes a lot. So with complexity comes a lot of uncertainty, things that are outside of your control. So it makes it, kind of a difficult place to try to sell. I think if you look at athletes, in particular, some stuff I'd say, again, from an enablement perspective, my view has always been, look, we can teach you how to sell our stuff. We can teach you the problems we solve. We can teach you why we're different, where we've done it before, all of those kinds of things. We can give you all that product knowledge. I guess some of the DNA level things can be learned, but the problem with a company like us and, usually the companies I've been at, we don't have the time to do that. So I've got to find people that have some of these, core attributes already. And it's things like discipline, just having, the discipline to get up every day and do the same thing over and over again. It's not always glamorous. I mean, sales is pretty repetitive and process driven, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's having the discipline, having the discernment, being able to get into these complex environments, be able to read the room, grit for an overused term, but I think it certainly applies, coachability, adaptability, resilience, dealing with adversity, all those types of things are really what make good enterprise sellers. And if I look at, individuals that, come more from an athlete background, they've been doing that for years, right? They're okay with that. They like the structure. They're going to learn on every play. They're going to go back and spend time in the film. They're going to learn what they did right, what they did wrong. They're going to learn what their competitors doing, what moves they're going to make, those types of things. So there's an amount of, obviously, the hard work that comes into that and the discipline that comes into, doing that study to try to get better, is key. And in sales, it's, in enterprise sales, it's, if you're closing 1 out of 5, opportunities, you're doing pretty good. You'll probably make your number and make a lot of money, which means you're going to fail 4 out of 5 times. And to be able to get up, brush yourself off, and get back at it again, is key. So I think, and then obviously the competitive nature. I mean, most people that are coming from an athletic background, whether we were talking about the Olympics before, whether if it's a team sport, I guarantee you the men's and women's U.S. hockey team, each individual is super competitive, as competitive as an individual figure skater might be. So, you're not going to teach that. They've got to kind of have that, and that's going to, drive them accordingly. So for me, like, they have these traits. The rest of the stuff we can teach them.
How do you, because when I was thinking about after you spoke about this, and I was looking at it, I was thinking a top performing sports person will have the coachability, which is one of the critical things that come up with all sales leaders. Resilience is 100% there, because if you're successful in sport, you've had to come over hardship. You're not great all the time. You can't win all the time. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But not all great sports people, or not even people who have success in sports, are going to be good at selling. So how do you work out which one's going to... And one of the key things when I was looking at actually, one of the things I thought, some are not great communicators. So they're good communicators within their team. They understand what's going on, and they could be within the business internally, but externally to clients, communication, we create. So how do you identify... Because it's not as easy as going, right, here's somebody who's had a great background in college baseball, could be a great salesperson. So how do you work out, right, we've got the fundamentals, the DNA is there, but how do you work out if this is still going to be right? I know it's not obviously foolproof. It doesn't always work. But in your mind, how are you trying to figure out, when you've got these athletes in front of you, if they can transfer it into sales? Because it's not easy.
Yeah, and you're right. Even with all the best diagnostic tools and the best resume and best referrals and all of that, you're going to make, some hires that don't work out. It's just kind of the nature of the game. You got to kind of plan for that. Eventually it is a leap of faith, just like it is, when someone's buying software, it's a leap of faith when you're, hiring somebody to some degree. But if I can eliminate a lot of the variables, I think the chances of success are better. So I think it's really just through interviews and multiple interviews, obviously any references that they have, other people that know them, how well do they communicate in, calls, interviews, even their written communication, just simple stuff like sending a thank you note, or a prep note, those types of things. Those are, pretty good signals, as well. But I mean, ultimately, like you said, one of the key things you said there is their ability to communicate internally, which is critical. Again, so if you're selling into these complex deals and you've got, 10 to 12 people that you need to sell to, on their end, and if you're in an early stage company, you need a team, right? You've got to have other folks on the sales team, and whether it's people, the CEO or me or the board or whomever, you've got, players on your team that you've got to, basically organize. Everyone uses the quarterback analogy, but I think it's a good one, right? You've got 11 players, 10 other players on the field, and they're all looking to you to direct them on what we're going to do on this particular play. And, if we're going to call an audible, they're going to be doing that. So you're on the field, you're the commander on the field. So being able to communicate with clarity, this is, how we're going to go after this deal. Here's how we're going to go win it. Here's what everybody's role is in this meeting or in this, in this pursuit. That ability to communicate internally and manage the team is critical for enterprise sales. And I think a lot of the folks, both in military, obviously, and in athletics, they are part of a team, so they do have to, have that ability to, communicate internally, and then, externally as well. But again, I think at some point it is a leap of faith. The big part, I think, too, is you can't just go out and hire raw talent. If you look at some of the best sports teams out there, they have a system, right? There's a way about doing things. There's playbooks, there's trainers, there's training, there's nutrition, there's everything around it that surrounds it. So the key is to create that, system. I call it a sales platform or selling system. And then if I don't have to go out and find, great sales talent that also knows supply chain and they know particular industry and they've got everything we're looking for. I mean, you're starting to kind of get into unicorn status at that point. My preference, I'd rather go hire for raw sales athleticism and then give them all the tools, the enablement, the structure, the organization around them, for them to be successful. Ultimately, it's up to them to, take advantage of all those things as well, but kind of, give them their franchise and say, hey, here it is. We're going to give you everything you need to make the burgers and all that kind of stuff, but you ultimately got to go out and go do it.
And it makes a lot of sense. There always seems to be a war on talent. Everybody's after the same hires, the plug and play salespeople. Some would argue that you're choosing a hard route because there is, and I'd love to hear how you go through onboarding and bringing these people up to speed. Because I think sometimes, I often say on this podcast and on LinkedIn posts that a true VP CRO is a sales coach. And they're there to mentor and help and develop people. But all too often, they just want to plug and play. They just want to hire someone that's going to go and sit in that corner and just do the job. Yeah. By doing this route, you are choosing a more challenging route. I think the right route. So how do you onboard these people? How are you providing them with the skills? And also, is there a difference in ramp time, or is that just an excuse you can actually get them up to speed quickly?
Yeah, well, I think from a ramp, again, if you're hiring, you're also within there, you're hiring for intelligence and the coachability, everything I'd mentioned before, and then a desire to learn. So I think the key thing, and the hardest part for smaller companies, earlier stage companies, is you don't have all that structure. When I got out of college, I went right into a sales program 6 months long and, was foisted away somewhere up in New England and, learned everything that I needed to learn and went out in the field and had a mentor. And it was like a Xerox level, kind of sales program, which was, one of the, back in the heyday, one of the best ones out there. So, but a lot of those are gone. Some of the bigger companies do have that, but the market is dominated mostly by, earlier stage companies, and they don't have that, those big, and very few even have somebody that's in charge of enablement. So, it is hard to do. So I think you've got to find people that can thrive in that kind of environment, they're okay with uncertainty. They don't need all that structure. They're curious, they're going to go out and, try to learn stuff, curious internally, curious about their customers, all that kind of stuff. So, but in general, you've got to make some investments early on enablement. And a lot of that starts with just the messaging, really understanding your messaging. And if you go back to companies like Force Management, I've been through their program several times. They always talk about, John Kaplan there talks about the 4 essential questions, which is what business problems are we solving? How specifically do we solve them? How do we solve them differently or uniquely? And where have we done it before? And what I find is, in general, the companies that can answer those 4 questions convincingly and consistently, everything in the go-to-market just becomes that much easier. When the number one response to those 4 questions is it depends, you've got some challenges. And guess what? The number one answer to those questions is depends, over and over. Everywhere I've been, it's always that. So it's really getting crisp around that. With that, now you can create, the messaging frameworks, the enablement frameworks, everything that the sales reps, and pre-sales and everyone else that's supporting them need to, go after the market. And then, obviously give them a territory of companies that have those problems that we can go sell to. So I think it's really around having some structure, recognizing the importance of enablement, recognizing that even the best talent needs coaching. The highest paid athletes on the planet all have coaches, probably several coaches, and they're teaching them everything from sleep and nutrition to just repetition of skills they learned when they were 8 years old, but still doing it to get better and better. And they're open to that coaching. So I think that's the key. If you've got the rep that has the answers to all the questions, not open to coaching, they're just going to be a harder project. And then everyone's individual. Everyone's an individual, so it can't just be blanket coaching. John, may need some help in this particular area. Jane needs help over here. Mary needs help there. Steve needs help over here. So it's being able to understand, your team. And in a CRO, you can only do so much because, the team gets big. So you've got to have good frontline managers that really are those frontline, in the field coaches that are there to help them.
I'd love to dive into a little bit about the difference between athletes and the military, because I think there's loads of attributes between the DNA between the two, which which goes together. But when I look at athletes, be it whatever sport domain they go in, they have to wake up every day to be the best version of themselves because someone else is trying to take their place. If you're not performing, the coach will just get rid of you and you're out. So you have to come there and do it. The military is slightly different because the military is an environment where it's a job, and the military environment and how it works is a little bit different to civilian life. So how do you assess if somebody is, I don't necessarily want to say institutionalized, but they perform in that environment, and the reason why they perform like that is because it's the environment, not the person?
Yeah, it's a good question, and frankly, I'd be lying to say that I've spent a lot of time dissecting it. I've kind of more on like the common things. A lot of those core, athlete traits are very similar in the military. You'd add things like mission oriented and things of that nature. But a lot of the discipline, resilience, those types of things are, and again, being open to being coached, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot more common things than things that are discommon. I think it's how they're coming to you. What are they looking for? Why are they getting out? Why are they looking to get into this world, sales? What is it about them, or what about this role that attracts them? And I think it's really just kind of, digging into their past experiences and how they're going to apply that to our world. Because in their world, I think it's a little, for whatever reason, I think it's harder for them. And I've worked with companies like the Honor Foundation, for example, that works primarily with special forces. Individuals start out with, Navy SEALs and then moved into, other branches, but have done some mentoring with them. And these are highly intelligent, best of the best, if you will, at what they do, which is certainly a lot more dangerous than what we do. But, they have a lot of those core attributes that we're looking for. But to them, a lot of them this is different and hard. It's a challenge for them as well. So I've had, several, like literally Navy SEALs say that this is the hardest job they've ever had. And I'm like, compared to what you were doing, like, oh yeah, no, this is way harder. And so to some degree, it's, and not all of them like it. Eventually, some of them are like, this wasn't a good move for me. I'm going to go do something different. But others see that as a challenge. And then it's really trying to take, like, what did you do, in your role on a daily basis? And how is that directly attributable to what we're trying to do? And then the things that aren't attributable, how do we help, skill them up, on that? So, but yeah, it's interesting. I don't think it's a blanket statement. If somebody just came out of the military, they're going to thrive in enterprise sales. For me personally, I never served, but I was fortunate to work with several former military officers and sales leaders from early in my career, and then kind of moved along from company to company a little bit in that network. And I just learned a lot about, from their perspective, what they're going to expect of us. And, you kind of had to have your crap together if you're going to sit down and meet with them around a forecast or what have you, and just having that drive. So for me, it's served me well, and to some degree, I've kind of looked at it as an opportunity to kind of pay back to or pass it on to others as well. So, but yeah, I think these aren't blanket statements. I've had plenty of sales reps that, best sales rep at my last company was, not an athlete, and she wasn't in the military, and she was selling medical devices in the OR, and she became one of the best software sales reps selling to commercial insurers. So, in a short period of time, but she had a lot of those same traits and attributes, but presented them in a different way.
It's not saying that if you hire these people, they're going to be your best people. It's when you're looking for a talent pool, there's a good reason to look at these guys. I think
the other thing too is, I think it's in the military in particular, sometimes it's, it's harder for them. I mean, and a lot of times they'll talk to somebody that just doesn't really know what they did, or doesn't have an appreciation, or may have a preconceived notion of what they do, and it may not be necessarily positive, so they don't even get a chance. Or, you don't have 15 years of enterprise sales experience, so therefore you could never figure this thing out. So to some degree, I think it's being able to get an opportunity. Again, there are some big companies that have veteran programs where they go out and seek veterans in particular, and they have all that structure and everything to transition them into those roles. But in the earlier stage companies, you kind of have to kind of rely on more like-minded people that are at least open to talking to somebody who may not have like the perfect background or track record that we're looking for, but willing to, take a chance or at least learn about them. And I think that's important. So my biggest advice to, the folks coming out of the military is just network. Keep talking to as many people as you can, and everybody you talk to, ask for another introduction. And, eventually you'll you'll learn that, this is not a career that you want to go after, or it is something you really want to get after, and you'll probably meet some interesting people along the way that could help you.
I think it's a great thing to consider. I always say when working with clients that when we're taking a job spec, we look at the person, then the professional.
Yeah.
What does someone need to be successful in this? And then we need to look at what they've done. Without a shadow of a doubt, if you look at professional first, you have a high failure rate. And if you look at the person first and you hire based on the person, the success rate is much higher, because everything, like you mentioned, that everything to do with selling tech, you can teach.
Everybody has a story. They have, it's always like, we'll talk to them and it's like, give me an example of where you overcame adversity. So it could have been a season-ending injury for an athlete, or it could have been, a pretty gnarly situation for somebody coming out of the military. But it's like, how did you deal with that? What did you learn? How did you come back from that? I think that's the critical piece, and like that self-awareness that comes with that is important. I've interviewed several people where it's like I can't really think of a time where I, had an adversity. So it's of a problem, because guess what? You're going to have a lot of them here. Like, this is the way it is. In sales and in a startup and in this environment, guess what? Like, this is not going to be comfortable. And you got to be okay with that.
Brilliant. We're almost done. I appreciate all the time that you've given to us. I've got one more question before I let you get back to your day job. You are Mr. Enterprise. Enterprise selling is something you have done for many years and really successful. If there was a CRO joining a new company that wasn't yet enterprise, but he was brought on to help them move in that direction, what would be the one bit of advice you would give to this sales leader?
I would say, just talk to people, go learn. Find me on LinkedIn or someone like me, and, just ping them, or her, and go talk to them, and, and ask some of those questions, hey, what's the difference? You've sold SMB, now you're doing enterprise, what does it take? So I think a lot of sales people and sales leaders want to have all the answers themselves, and, are just not good at asking for advice. I've been doing this for 30, who's going to tell me anything I don't know? Well, guess what? Like, every day. I learn something new on LinkedIn. I pick up the phone. I call people all the time, and, it could be something different. And don't really have a lot of experience opening up Asia Pacific. Let's call somebody who's done that 4 times. See all the mistakes they made so I don't go make it. So I guess that would be my advice is, network, go find some leaders that have been successful in the enterprise and go ask them, why they think they've been successful. Most people are willing to talk. It's just, you got to go outreach. So I think it's a little bit of lower the ego a little bit, recognize it's new. There's a lot to learn, and it's evolving. I've had a lot of success in my career, but if I dust off my old playbooks, they're completely irrelevant for today. Last week, things changed, right? So I don't know, that's my advice, is just talk to people and benchmark with others.
I think that's perfect. I think the more people you can talk to, getting insight from how different people, because everybody will tell you a slightly different story as well. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the planning sessions and doing this, and I've learned a huge amount myself, and I can really understand why you've had the success you've had. So really appreciate you stopping by and joining and answering some questions.
Great. Well, again, glad you had me. Thanks, James. Appreciate it.